Hello, Bio 130 students, to our very last video lesson for the lecture component of Bio 130. Oh man, thank goodness. We've made it through the digestive, urinary, respiratory, circulatory, integumentary, skeletal, muscular, special senses. We made it through many other body systems and sensory information interpretation systems. However, now we're going to get to the endocrine system, which is essentially composed of the many glands in our body, which produces important hormones to help us regulate many functions in our body. So, endocrine system, think glands, hormone producing glands. And, well, as hormones are meant to do, these help with signaling pathways of our body. For example, nervous system is our wired pathway, which essentially through electrical signaling, a message is quickly sent through interconnected neurons, resulting in a short-lived response. However, when it comes to the other type of signaling pathway, the endocrine system, think of it as like a wireless pathway. This is done via chemical signaling. Essentially, some gland of the endocrine system releases a hormone which slowly travels, typically through the bloodstream. And then, however, as that hormone is circulating in our body, it can give off a long-lived response. So, nervous system, it's any responses that are produced through a nervous signal. Well, those are usually pretty quick-lived and short-lived, and that's all they're going to be. Whereas an endocrine signal is from chemical hormones that don't actually travel through a electrical pathway. So they're wireless per se, and they will give off a long-term response. For example, testosterone, progesterone, things like that, hormones like those, they're not very short-lived. You don't just produce them, get a signal, and you're done. They can last quite a significantly longer time than just an electrical signal. Now, functions of the endocrine system, besides essentially being our hormone-producing glands that act as a wireless pathway, the main functions are essentially to produce and secrete hormones that regulate the cells and organ activities in our body, which include growth, metabolism, and sexual development. So the endocrine system, essentially, it affects our reproductive system, because if it's affecting growth, it's affecting puberty. It affects our skeletal muscular system because that has to grow as well. Metabolism, that is essentially what's involved in, well, our digestive system, circulatory system, many things that use chemical and physical processes. So the endocrine system has hormones that affect all those as well. And well, sexual development. So again, going back to the reproductive system. So endocrine system, it mainly affects growth, metabolism, and sexual development, which basically means the endocrine system affects every system of our body for our entire lives. Now, there is what is called endocrinology, which is essentially the study of the endocrine glands and hormones. Now, there are three types of glands, and or I should say, three types of hormones. And all three types are essentially what is studied in endocrinology, even though only the first one is called endocrine hormones. When a hormone is an endocrine hormone, these are hormones that essentially will have to travel great distances from where they are produced. For example, something produced in a gland in the torso, or should I say, maybe something produced in the brain has to eventually travel to perhaps the adrenal glands or some other gland. that has to travel quite a far distance. So if it's a hormone that needs to travel a long distance in the body before it produces a response, that would be an endocrine hormone. Paracrine hormones, they travel a small distance from where they were produced. Basically, maybe from one tissue to a nearby tissue, from one organ to a very nearby organ, or a very nearby blood vessel in right near that particular organ. Now, autocrine hormones, these essentially hardly travel any distance. These are hormones made in a cell, and they're made to essentially produce a response in that same cell or move to an adjacent nearby cell. So endocrine hormones, these are traveling very far in the body from where they are produced to where they need to be received. Paracrine hormones are much closer, and autocrine hormones are essentially hormones that only have to travel, say, maybe one or a few cells from where they are produced to where they need to go to produce a response. And once again, even though only the first one is called endocrine, because no one ever decided to make paracrinology or autocrinology, endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine hormones are all lumped together as part of endocrinology. Now, there are the common and minor endocrine glands, and each one is important for producing the core hormones to basically help us do stuff. And the common endocrine glands are going to be the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is essentially called the master gland because it can affect a lot of the other glands in the endocrine system. There's also the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, which are essentially right attached on each other. There's also the adrenal glands, which are located on the top part of each kidney. And then the gonads, which are going to be either the testes or the ovaries. And even though the pancreas shows up in the digestive system, it is also a common endocrine gland, because this is where essentially you're making insulin to respond to glucose levels. Now, there are two other minor glands, which are the pineal gland and the thymus. And let's get into these glands. There is one pathway called the hypothalamic pituitary pathway. And let's put it this way. In most cases, endocrine hormones are regulated by the hypothalamic pituitary pathway. What happens is the hypothalamus will release some specific releasing hormone into an artery nearby the hypothalamus. And this particular artery moves directly from the hypothalamus right to the pituitary gland, very quickly, very specifically, going from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And essentially, the releasing hormone that is given off by the hypothalamus, it will tell the pituitary gland to release a certain stimulating hormone. And the stimulating hormone will then travel to another gland to stimulate a certain response. So to put it in other words, the hypothalamic pituitary pathway is essentially the hypothalamus will release some particular hormone, which will tell the pituitary gland what other hormone to release into the overall bloodstream. And then that released stimulating hormone will then go to some other gland, some other organ to tell it what it needs to do. It's because the pituitary gland is what actually releases the stimulating hormone that actually interacts with any other gland. That's why the pituitary gland is called the master gland, because it can more or less tell the other glands what to do. after receiving the appropriate information from the hypothalamus. And both of these glands are located in our brains, in our heads. Going more into the pituitary gland, it is divided into two parts, which are the anterior and posterior lobe. The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland produces the stimulating hormones that it will secrete and release. And the secretion and release of these stimulating hormones are regulated by the hypothalamus. So, just to say that again, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, that's the part of the pituitary gland that is regulated by the hypothalamus, hypothalamic pituitary pathway. And essentially, the anterior lobe is what produces stimulating hormones that will need to be released when signaled by the hypothalamus to affect other glands in the body. Now, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland does not produce hormones and is not regulated by the hypothalamus. Or, I should say this in a different way. Oh, never mind. Yes, to say that again, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland does not make any hormones, and it is not regulated by the hypothalamus. Instead, the hormones that the posterior lobe will eventually secrete are actually made elsewhere in the brain and stored in the posterior lobe until it's appropriate to release them. These hormones travel to the pituitary gland and are stored until they need to be secreted. So, anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, it produces hormones, and they are only released when told to by the hypothalamus. The posterior lobe does secrete hormones, but it secretes hormones that were produced elsewhere in the brain, and the release or secretion of those posterior lobe hormones, the hormones stowed in there, is not dictated by the hypothalamus. Now, getting into the anterior lobe, the kinds of hormones the pituitary lobe will release to affect other glands when told to release them by the hypothalamus. There is the thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, which essentially stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones, like it says. There's also the pituitary gland's anterior lobe, if told to by the hypothalamus, can also release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. And essentially, this stimulates the adrenal glands to produce various steroid hormones. So these guys, once released by the pituitary gland, travel to the adrenal glands on the top of each kidney. So effectively going from the head to the lower back of the spine. Very insane distance for bodies. There's also luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. When the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland releases either of those, these essentially manage the control of sexual function and the production of sex steroids, which for biological women would be estrogen and progesterone, or, well, any person will release estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone will produce those, but in biological women, the estrogen and progesterone will be in higher concentration and be released more often, whereas in biological males, testosterone will be released more often. And then another stimulating hormone released by the anterior gland when told to do so by the hypothalamus is prolactin, which stimulates breast milk production. So, typically not something that shows up in men, but more or less women. under typical circumstances. Now, getting into the posterior lobe, there are two main hormones that will be stored in the posterior lobe to be released when certain conditions are met. One, and again, these are not produced by the pituitary gland, these are produced elsewhere in the brain. One hormone would be antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin, which essentially controls water loss by the kidneys. So, if too much water is being released and the body's getting dehydrated, antidiuretic hormone can basically can travel to the kidneys telling them, hey, reabsorb some water or don't absorb water, whatever needs to happen to balance out the water volume in the blood. And then there's also oxytocin, which contracts the uterus during childbirth and once again is another hormone that stimulates the production of milk for when it's needed. Now, getting into the throat is where the thyroid gland is, and essentially the thyroid hormones produced by the thyroid gland help regulate metabolism, the growth of bones, development of the brain and nervous system, especially in children, maintaining blood pressure and a healthy heart rate, digestion, muscle tone, reproductive functions. The thyroid gland does a lot of things. Therefore, any disorder or disease that affects the thyroid gland is going to be affecting many areas of the body. Therefore, thank goodness there's a lot of medicinal treatments out there to help with thyroid conditions like hypothyroidism or hypothyroidism, things like that. Basically, it's very important to keep your thyroid in check if you do need those medical assistance. For example, just skipping your thyroid pills one day of the week can just offset everything in your body. In fact, even to dangerous levels that might even cause a response of eventual death. So, if you have thyroid medicine and your doctor recommends that you take it, it's a very strong recommendation to consistently take it every day, or however long they tell you in whatever time interval. Now, located on the thyroid are essentially parathyroid glands. So, parathyroid part attached to the thyroid. And, well, the parathyroid glands are essentially release hormones that regulate calcium levels in the bloodstream and also bone metabolism. So these are on the thyroid itself, and which is located in the throat. So essentially, we're slowly making our way downwards from the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in our brains to the thyroid and parathyroid in our throat. So moving downward. Now we're going to get into the adrenal glands, which these are located on each kidney, on the top of each kidney, which the kidneys are located toward the back of the small of the spine. The adrenal glands, basically you can look at it this way. The adrenal cortex, which is the outside of the adrenal glands, and then the adrenal medulla, which is the inside of the adrenal glands. The cortex produces corticosteroids, which help regulate metabolism, the homeostasis or the healthy balance of salt and water. It also helps with the immune system as well as sexual function. Now, the medulla of the adrenal glands, the internal parts, essentially produce catecholamines, which could be adrenaline, epinephrine, dopamine as well. These help the body cope with physical and emotional stress by either increasing heart rate or blood pressure. If you're in danger, you want to help your heart rate increase so that you can get oxygen through your body quicker to help move the muscles and keep the muscles going quicker if you have to run away. Things like that. So, we've now gone to the adrenal glands, which are on top of each kidney. Let's go toward the gonads, the reproductive glands. One type is ovaries, which essentially primarily produce estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen, it helps with fat storage. It can also cause and affect depression, breast cancer, inhibits thyroid hormone. So if you have an imbalance of estrogen, it can cause a lot of issues. Likewise, progesterone, if you have too much of this, it can actually help you burn fat, too much so it can be an antidepressant, but in the dangerous direction, where it can be a breast cancer preventer, which is nice, and it can also facilitate thyroid hormone. So estrogen and progesterone, they kind of have opposite issues or opposite benefits. They kind of balance each other. So having too much of one in a ratio with the other can cause a whole host of issues. So the ovaries help keep those in check. Now, testes, they primarily produce testosterone, which has typically only affects physical development and the ability to produce sperm in high enough quantities to efficiently actually travel through the female reproductive system for fertilization of the egg. So, reproductive glands, essentially these are affecting the steroids of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and trying to keep them in healthy amounts. Going into a different gland, which as said previously is a organ of the digestive system, is the pancreas. And essentially the pancreas, it is responsible for insulin, which is our body's response to glucose. And let's say, for whatever reason, blood glucose, the sugar inside dissolved in our bloodstream, increases. Well, the pancreas will release insulin, which promotes the uptake of glucose into our cells, so removing it from the bloodstream and placing it in our cells. Therefore, eventually the blood glucose will drop. The actual amount of glucose that's floating in our bloodstream will decrease in concentration. And when that happens, the pancreas can release glucagon, which promotes glycogen breakdown. Essentially, when cells store glucose, they turn them into long chains of glucose, which forms glycogen. Therefore, if too much glucose has been removed from the bloodstream, the pancreas will release glucagon, which tells our cells to start breaking down the glycogen sugars inside them and release glucose back into the bloodstream. And then if too much glucose gets into the bloodstream, the pancreas makes insulin, which tells the cells to remove glucose from the bloodstream and take them into the cells. So it's basically a balancing act between the pancreas making insulin, telling glucose to go from our bloodstream into our cells, or producing and releasing glucagon, the pancreas releasing glucagon to tell our cells to break down glycogen to make glucose and put it back into the bloodstream. So it's a balancing act, and it's very important to make sure that that balancing act is balanced safely. Now, there are two minor organs. They are not the big endocrine glands that most people will think about. In fact, sometimes some sources will actually leave these completely out as far as the endocrine system is concerned, but we'll include them just in case you ever do have to interact with them or hear them. If you're a law clerk reporting something, you'll at least have heard pineal and thymus. Pineal gland is located in the middle of the brain, and it secretes melatonin, which is essentially responsible for us maintaining a healthy wake-sleep cycle. And then there's also the thymus, which is located both anterior and superior to the heart, so more above and toward the front in respective of where the heart is at. But it's also located posterior to the sternum, so using terminology to basically say it's somewhat above and in front of the heart, but it's behind the chest plate. The thymus, it helps train T lymphocytes, T cells, which are very strong white cells, very strong immune cells. And so the thymus, it basically, it's like it's where our T cells will get what they need to survive or to be trained in like a white blood cell, hyper uber white blood cell boot camp basic training. Now, T cell training in the thymus, essentially what happens is T cells are produced in the red bone marrow, like all other blood cells, and these will travel to the cortex of the thymus. In the cortex, epithelial cells essentially present a variety of antigens. These antigens are markers from either foreign cells that come from outside the body, bacterial or other cells, and also parts of, say, viruses or, again, bacteria, other things, certain antigens that basically tell the body, hey, this is something that probably should not belong inside the body. That way, these T cells gain the ability to recognize these certain hazard indicators. The cells that specifically respond to these markers are selected to survive, whereas and then move on to the medulla of the thymus, whereas any T cell that does not actually show the ability to recognize these markers, they actually die off and are killed. Now, once any surviving T cell makes it to the medulla, they are essentially presented with the body's own antigens. So in the cortex, they were presented with antigens telling the T cells, these are things that you should attack if you see them. Now, in the medulla, the T cells are presented with the body's own antigens. And this basically this is basically where the thymus can see whether the T cell will try to attack the body or will actually ignore the antigens of the body. And for any T cells that do not respond to and do not attack the body's antigens, these are selected to survive and leave the thymus. So in order to pass T cell uber white blood cell boot camp, you need to be able to recognize hazardous antigens from pathogens when they are presented to you in the cortex, and you need to recognize antigens that do belong in the body and not attack them when you're going through the medulla. And this is a very, very selective process. Only 2% of T lymphocyte cells that are produced in the bone marrow that make it to the thymus for basic training, only 2% of them will actually make it through. So I'm not sure if this is on par with Navy SEALs. I don't know if that's like 1% or less or more. I'm not sure. But this is essentially the Navy SEALs of white blood cells. Now, for those T lymphocyte cells, for those T cells that do survive and make it to maturity, they leave the thymus and they essentially enter the bloodstream. And what they do is essentially they recognize and kill foreign pathogens, bacteria, viruses that enter our bloodstream. They will activate another type of cell, which are B cells. And B cells are what produce antibodies to help recognize diseases for future use. And then T cells are also responsible for storing memory of past infections. So storing information from, say, some particular virus of influenza or some particular virus of, well, coronavirus. There are different types of viruses and different types of each virus. That's the different strains. The T cells are responsible for after conquering and killing a virus or a pathogen, bacteria, what have you, essentially storing some kind of information to remind it later if it ever comes across that same pathogen again, to quickly get rid of it. Very, very, very awesome machinery in our bodies. Now, continuing with the thymus. Throughout childhood, the thymus grows and enlarges, and after puberty and throughout adulthood, the thymus shrinks and slowly is replaced with adipose tissue. So basically, the site where T cells go through basic training more or less eventually disappears. Now, the immune system produces most of its T cells during childhood, and these things actually will survive quite a long time because they are meant to be very rugged, very tough, survive the harshest conditions. And essentially, once you make it past childhood and have produced the majority of your T cells, very rarely will you ever be required to produce new T cells after puberty, because these things are ridiculously tough. Now, just going to go through one slide of diseases just to keep this short and just to keep this one video. Here are some example diseases of the endocrine system, and we're going to look at just a thyroid for these two. One of them is hypothyroidism. Hypo basically means that the thyroid is underactive. It is not as active as it should be. Therefore, it is not producing enough thyroid hormone to keep the body's functions regulated normally. An indication of hypothyroidism includes an excessively elevated level of thyroid stimulating hormone in our bloodstreams. Basically, look at it this way. The pituitary gland releases thyroid stimulating hormone, and if the normal amount of thyroid stimulating hormone does not actually get the thyroid to do its job at the right levels, well, then the pituitary gland will feel like it needs to produce and release even more thyroid stimulating hormone, essentially trying to produce so much that it does get the thyroid to do what it should. So if you have a lot of the stimulating hormone, a lot more than you should, that's basically a sign that your thyroid is underactive and needs a lot of stimulation to actually get to a more reasonable level. Ergo, hypothyroidism. Now, on the opposite end is hyperthyroidism. This essentially, the thyroid is overactive, much more active than it is healthy. And this can result in dangerous weight loss and very uncomfortable to dangerous rapid and irregular heartbeat. So, thymia, all those other things. Very dangerous, irregular heartbeat. And yeah, hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism. Those are just two diseases of the endocrine system, which once again, these are just the glands, the hormone-producing glands of the body. And as is the case with many other systems of the body, the endocrine system affects many other body systems. So your entire body is a set of very connected body systems that each have their own functions and yet have high sway and control in affecting the functions of all the others. And that is what makes you all a unified organism. So just past the 35-minute mark, it is a pleasure to conclude this crazy semester of Bio 130 online distance education. Therefore, it is a pleasure to have done the lecture. And, well, honestly, it is so good that you all are very near the finish line. So, not to get too close to the 36-minute mark, it is a pleasure to be finishing the lecture along with all of you. Catch you guys for the lab.